Looking back at the 20th century, writes Margot Norris in her study Writing War in the 20th Century, we might at first be struck by the incommensurability of two of its hallmarks, modern mass warfare and innovative art. Although the relationship between war and its artistic representation goes back to antiquity, the question of whether modern warfare was a stimulus to aesthetic experimentation and innovation, as early 20th century artists and critics claimed, or whether art became increasingly defeated by events and spectacles seemingly beyond its powers of representation, as war became incalculably wide-scale and violent in conduct, has remained a complex and tortured issue. For some artists and thinkers, such as the German cultural theorist Theodor Adorno, in his famous misunderstood dictum that writing poetry after Auschwitz was barbaric, or the French director and journalist Claude Lanzmann, whose 9-hour documentary film Shoah enacts his conviction that the Shoah cannot be represented, modern warfare, and particularly here genocide, pushed the limits of artistic representation to breaking point. Yet the fact remains that while art stands so often accused of being unable to respond with adequate and appropriate gravity and meaningfulness to the worst human atrocities imaginable, it has also unceasingly made of that imputed impossibility the very possibility and condition of its continued engagement with the events of the bloodiest century in human history, events that left, at a conservative estimate, more than 100 million people dead in less than 100 years. For those who like averages and statistics, that's 1 million per year, 83,333 a month, 2,739 a day, 114 an hour, or 2 a minute. This census of the war dead, more civilians than soldiers, clearly resists and exceeds representation and attempts at signification, particularly ontological signification. The French philosopher Edith Vichogrod, in her book Spirit of Ashes, added an interesting temporal dimension to the vast numbers of 20th century war dead by formulating what she calls the death event. In other words, a warfare phenomenon in which compressed time plays a new and powerful role in the systematic, rational calculation for maximizing human destruction. This death event was inaugurated by World War I, but it did not end with the war to end all wars, nor with Guernica, nor with Dresden, the Shoah, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the blanket bombing of Vietnam. The brief but extremely destructive 1991 Persian Gulf War managed both to combine the death event with the technological world and to turn it into a post-Cold War philosophy of war. It was a disturbing reminder that the death event had become an acceptable part of Western culture, while the Rwandan genocide of 1994, which left 800,000 dead in 90 days, amply demonstrated that machetes could be just as effective in delivering destruction in compressed time as the 88,500 tons of bombs the coalition dropped on Iraq in the first days of the Gulf War. And the list could go on from Bosnia in the 1990s to current-day Syria. This preamble should give some general context to the nature of aspects of my research over the last few years, where I deal with different types of what I call limit experience, but which all share some aspect of Vichogrod's death event, and pose questions of the relationship between aesthetics, or artistic representation, and ethics, or the moral purposes and effects of art. In chronological order, these limit experiences are the trenches of the Western Front, the Nazi concentration and extermination camps, and the wars and genocides of post-colonial Francophone sub-Saharan Africa. The main focus of my research in these areas is on the poetic and narrative strategies employed in French and Francophone texts that represent the violence of warfare and genocide, or their physical, psychological and traumatic repercussions, raising all sorts of questions I can only hint at here. Since war, for example, is what Norris terms a world-unmaking event, a reality deconstructing and defamiliarizing activity, one of the challenges literary texts must take up is how to make war's inherent epistemological disorientation, its sense of experienced unreality, real. This challenge can easily make writers vulnerable to the temptations of the genre of the unreal, the abnormal, the grotesque, the surreal, and the expressionistic, lending to the writing on and of war powerful conventions of horror and disgust, but also carrying with them the ideological load of pathology and irrationality. This, in a way, would be the literary equivalent to cinematic goreography, a neologism coined from gore and pornography, used to characterize recent Asian horror films or slasher films or the Hollywood Saw franchise, where the reader, spectator's gaze on the exteriorization of horror, represented, read, seen, but inadequately incorporated into the reading, seeing moral eye, would straddle the thin line between voyeurism and witness. This in turn would link to a related set of questions involving the psychological, ontological and ethical risks and responsibilities entailed in entering the world of such violence. The risk on the one hand, perhaps the crudest, as the notion of gorography would intimate, of having representations of violence excite pleasure, and the responsibility on the other of engaging in enabling and facilitating the ethical encounter with the other that for theorists and philosophers such as J. Hillis Miller, Jacques Derrida, Emmanuel Levinas and others, all reading entails. So what does all this have to do with my subject at hand? Everything. Because over the last 10 years or so, there's been a growing trend in contemporary French fiction to engage with history from all periods and countries, but in particular with the Second World War. Given the specific historical, political, cultural and intellectual context of France's checkered wartime past, what the French historian Henri Rousseau termed the Vichy syndrome that refuses to disappear, this phenomenon may not in itself be surprising. Unlike the First World War, the Second for France does not connote the horrors, carnage and military absurdities of the battlefield and the relatively clear-cut moral necessity of defending la patrie, but rather the moral grey and decidedly black zones of occupation, collaboration, resistance and deportation. The high-profile war crime trials of Klaus Barbie, Paul Touvier and Maurice Papin, groundbreaking cinematic documentaries such as Alain René's Night and Fog, despite its ambiguity on the Jewish deportation, Marcel Orful's The Sorrow and the Pity, which exploded the Gaullist-inspired myth of La France résistante, or Claude Lanzmann's previously mentioned Shoah, the continual celebration of literary honour saved through the resistance poetry of Louis Aragon, Paul Éluard, Robert Desnos, highly regarded French language testimony and prose fiction on the concentration and extermination camps by survivors such as Elie Wiesel, Anna Langfuss, Piotrowicz, David Rousset, Antelme, Charlotte Delbo, Georges Semprin, revisionist and negationist historians such as Robert Faurisson, political figures such as Jean-Marie Le Pen. All of this has contributed to keeping the Second World War, in one form or another, firmly at the forefront of French political, intellectual and literary debate. So if the presence of the war in the contemporary French novel is not, as I said, particularly surprising in itself, the intriguing riddle, if you like, my concession to the conference theme, is just what the novel is doing with it, how it's doing it, in other words, the narrative techniques and strategies being adopted, and the aesthetic, ethical, political and cultural issues being raised. One could certainly argue, for instance, that after almost 70 years since its end, the Second World War still constitutes a sort of screen onto which current generations can project their debates, doubts and contradictions in order to better circumscribe their own democratic and, in France's case, republican values and identity. No doubt the most publicised of French novels over the last decade on a subject related to the Second World War is Jonathan Little's 900-page opus, The Kindly Ones, winner of the Goncourt Prize for 2006. Whatever one's reaction to the novel, recoil, for example, at Little's decision to write from the perpetrator's point of view, or the portrayal itself of the incestuous, murderous narrator protagonist, there is no doubt that Little rekindled debate and controversy around the question of the literary representation of the Shoah by bullets or by gas, and the complex relations between history, memory and fiction. But both the media hype and scholarly publications around Little's novel have unfortunately tended to eclipse the many other recent French novels to have adventured onto the thorny terrain of the Second World War from many angles, and not just from that of the explicit representation of the violence of warfare and genocide. Macro and micro histories, the political and the personal, history and fiction, memory and imagination, the past and the present. Contemporary French fiction is exploring it all. Some of these novels are by extremely popular writers with a large fan-based readership, guaranteeing a relatively high level of media exposure. Eric Emanuel Schmidt, for example, in The Other's Share, follows through alternating chapters the parallel lives of two Adolf Hitlers, the failed artist and virulent anti-Semite we all know, and the one who in 1908 was admitted to the Viennese Academy of Fine Arts, married a Jewish woman, had children, and became a famous avant-garde painter. Marc Levy's The Children of Freedom is a fictional reconstruction of his own father and uncle's involvement in Jews in the Toulouse section of the French Resistance. And then there's Didier Van Courvelaer's recent The Woman of Our Lives, mixing one man's scientific destiny with the Third Reich's 1941 euthanasia program and German anti-Nazi opposition. Other novels are distinguished efforts by first-time novelists, joining the literary foray through subjects that canny editors and publishers know will sell. Soisy Garonne, for instance, in her Clara's No, offers a subtle and engaging account of the psychological state of the eponymous protagonist back in Paris after her deportation to Auschwitz. Beatrice Villeneuve's The Last Sonata of Winter intertwines the lives of two Russian musicians, a German brother and sister, and a small community of musicians attempting to maintain a semblance of cultural dignity as a war-torn Berlin collapses around them. In 2008, Olivier Elkaim published her first novel, The Graffiti of Chambord, a poignant reflection on memory, forgetting and guilt through the interlacing and intergenerational narratives of a Jewish father involved in both resistance activities during the occupation and an extramarital affair, and his contemporary banker son's attempts to understand both himself and his family history. Laurent Cohen's 2010 Sol explores competing levels of reading through an historian of Vichy who goes literally mad over an arcane text and confronts Nazi mysticism with the Talmud. But the vast majority of French fiction on an aspect of the Second World War has been either by established, well-respected writers and intellectuals or by novelists whose work is still relatively unknown. And I'm not going to go all through these. These are just some of the texts I would have spoken about, but I'd like to get to the four main ones. As you can see, these are all within the year 2000, some more recent than that. These ones are by, these are well-known novelists, very respected novelists and intellectuals. These ones are lesser-known novelists, but nevertheless have contributed to the debate. So I'm going to skip all that and get to the last part of my paper. So regardless of the literary quality of these novels, this plethora of examples, and there are many more I haven't read, does clearly demonstrate that the Second World War as a subject covers a multitude of sins and has proven to be fertile ground for Jewish and non-Jewish authors, men and women, first-time and unknown novelists, as well as the already critically acclaimed. What I'd like to do in the 7 or 8 minutes I have left is to focus briefly on 4 recent novels that have particularly caught my attention. 2 of these novels are first-person narratives, and 2 are third-person so-called omniscient narratives. All of them, however, raise intriguing aesthetic and ethical questions about representing the great puzzle of the Second World War. That's my last concession to the conference theme. Here we go. My first text is Laurent Binet's HHHH, winner of the 2008 Goncourt Prize for First Novel and recently translated into Hebrew. The novel ostensibly tells the story of Reinhard Heydrich, known as the executioner or butcher of Prague, the most dangerous man in the Third Reich. To a certain extent, this aspect of the novel is another variation on the banality of evil motif. Heydrich is a mediocre human being, but a consummate bureaucrat, and as such the architect of the final solution and widely believed to be the reason behind Heinrich Himmler's rise in the Nazi hierarchy. HHHH. Himmler's Hirn heißt Heydrich, Himmler's brain is called Heydrich. But even though Heydrich's own rise to power occupies the first 150 pages of the novel, he's not Binet's main interest. Rather, he's concerned with the 2 résistants, the Slovakian Josef Gabčík and the Czech Jan Kubis, parachuted from London to assassinate Heydrich, which despite sheer bad luck, they eventually succeed in doing on May 27, 1942. There is, of course, widespread Nazi retribution, betrayal, and a final showdown where Gabčík, Kubis, and their accomplices commit suicide rather than be taken prisoner. The story of Heydrich's assassination and its perpetrators is widely known, so the originality of Binet's fictional reconstruction lies not in its subject, but in its narrative treatment. Divided into 2 parts and 257 numbered sections ranging from 1 sentence to anything up to 10 pages, the novel creates a narrator who pushes to the forefront of his narrative his struggles to avoid fictionalization and what he sees as the inevitable necessity of fictional reconstruction of historical facts. In the process, the narrator not only accesses his own personal life, for example, his position as a teacher of French in a Slovakian military academy, his mania for historical documentation, his relationship with his father, his former and present girlfriends, but above all, he constantly interrogates, discusses and comments upon other fictional, historical and cinematic representations of the assassination. But Binet's infra-novel also offers a vast array of reflections on representation, historical and fictional writing in general, and on the war in particular, citing Milan Kundera, Gustave Flaubert, Jerry Weil and Jonathan Little, the historians Raoul Hilberg and Edouard Toussaint, the collaborationist René Bousquet and his murderer, all with as much ease as Quentin Tarantino, James Bond and Sherlock Holmes. For some, Binet's text reflects what they see as the postmodern contemporary approach to history. Others find particularly grating the disparity between the meticulous historical detail, the self-conscious quality of the narrative, and the personal life of the narrator. Others again think that Binet had a great story, but is simply a catastrophic storyteller. My second novel is Fabrice Humbert's The Origin of Violence, winner of the 2009 Orange Prize and the 2010 Renaudot Prize for Best Paperback. The novel moves deftly between fiction, autobiography, memory and history, with its first-person narrator novelist opening by interweaving reflections on the sporadic outbursts of his own violent behaviour, with a visit with his pupils as a teacher in a Franco-German high school in Paris, the Buchenwald concentration camp. There, in the museum, the narrator discovers the photo of a camp prisoner who strangely resembles his own father. Tormented by the image, he begins a search to discover the identity of the prisoner, only to find out that the man he successfully identifies as David Wagner is his own real paternal grandfather. There follows, largely through Wagner's surviving brother Charles and the former Buchenwald deportee Serge Kolb, who had befriended Wagner in the camp, the story of the immigrant Jewish tailor who wanted to marry a rich non-Jewish woman for her money, but instead fell in love and had a passionate love affair with the wife of the brother of his intended bride, whose father, we discover at the end, had made sure he was arrested and deported. The narrator's own father, taciturn and alienated from his extended family, was the result of the affair, brought up by the cuckolded husband as his own child. The novel unfolds then like a mystery story, gradually revealing the skeletons in the cupboard of two families. On the one hand, the Jewish Wagners and the unknown grandfather murdered by a Nazi doctor in Buchenwald. On the other, the rich Fabre family with whom the narrator grew up. The story gets more complicated when in the second part, the narrator starts an affair with a German woman whose own grandfather was a high-ranking Nazi officer. The main subject of the novel, however, is, as the title indicates, the origin of violence. In effect, the narrator spends much of the novel as the family and personal histories unfold, reflecting not only on Nazi violence in the camps and the determination to humiliate its victims before killing them, but also, for example, on contemporary violence in French suburbs and the kidnapping and murder of Ilan Halimi in 2006. Still, although Humbert constructs his novel with agility and narrative suspense, there is an element in all of this, as in Binet, of the banality of evil, of the apathy or profiteering of the masses, with the implicit conclusion that we are all capable of this violence. We can all unleash the evil, given the exceptional circumstances. My third text is Dominique Jamet's 2008 A Traitor, based on the true story of French collaborationist Jacques Vasseur. In one sense, the novel is both an illustration of Humbert's conclusion and an interesting parallel read to Little's novel. Jamet, a journalist, novelist and former director of the French National Library, whose own childhood and adolescence were marked by his father's collaborationist past, follows the trajectory of Jean Delot, a brilliant young student whose transparent liquid character, Delot, leads him to opt for collaboration with the German military authorities in the town of Neuville in the Touraine-Loire Valley and to become the head of the local French Gestapo. Jamet's narrative succeeds brilliantly in recreating the climate of the period with all its moral ambiguities and existential choices, but it shows neither fascination nor overt condemnation for its protagonist, even though Delot's actions speak eloquently for themselves as he goes from translator and bureaucrat for the local commandatur to an enthusiastic hunter of anyone suspected of resistance activities. His interrogations of suspects gradually becomes more violent. The torture he inflicts clearly increasingly addictive. The obvious psychological lack of empathy and emotional castration he exhibits are explained by an overly possessive mother. In any case, he follows his choice to its logical conclusion, fleeing France with the last of the German troops. Condemned to death in absentia after the liberation, his peregrinations to escape justice take him to Northern Europe before bringing him back incognito to France, where he spends the next 20 years living in secret with the only love of his life, his mother. Unable to set foot outside, he takes up his studies again, develops all manner of scientific theories, occasionally ruminates on the past, until one day a chance knock on the door delivers him to French justice. He's going to be condemned a second time. He'll be released after 20 years in prison. He moves to Germany with the wife he married while in prison. Although Jamet's text then is roughly a chronological linear narrative from 1925 to the 2000s, it is not a straightforward account of events. Rather, Jamet judiciously intersperses comments and documentation from Delot's 1968 trial, as well as numerous reflections on real political and historical figures the fictional Delot comes into contact with. Many left-wing critics praise the novel as a timely reminder of where flirting with right-wing politics can lead. Right-wing critics responded in kind, but that's France. Just 2 minutes on my last text. Bruno Tesseraert's 2009 The Guardians, a novel which clearly announces its generic status as historical fiction in an authorial note at the end stating that apart from the protagonist diplomat Patrice Orvieto and his brother Serge, the majority of the characters are real persons who really existed. Tesseraert assures us that historical, scientific and academic documentation all attest to what, via his characters, he says about, for example, the Evian Conference, the London Committee, the secret work of the British MI6, or the covert American operations to exfiltrate into the US and whitewash high-profile Nazi scientists at the end of the war. The character of Orvieto allows Tesseraert to follow the catastrophic and hypocritical diplomatic efforts to avoid war, the outbreak of the war itself, the defeat and capitulation of France, the occupation, resistance, and eventual liberation. But the narrative, divided into years and the names of cities in which the fate of the West and the Jews were sealed, extends well beyond the war into the year 2000, the year of Jan Karski's death. Karski plays an important role in the narrative. Through him in particular, the war is seen as a turning point in the West's political and moral history. Yet the central figure of the novel is neither the fictional Orvieto nor the real Karski. It is the Shoah, and specifically the difficulty the Allies had in grasping the reality of the final solution. The novel's title, The Guardians, refers to those who had access to the truth but either didn't want to believe it, didn't know what to do with it, or relegated it to secondary importance behind winning the war. While Tesseraert admittedly brings nothing historically new to the table, the distillation of information and the way the fate of characters all intertwine with the Shoah and its aftermath still raise hard questions about the West's moral guilt during and after the war. In 1 minute to conclude, 30 seconds. I started by outlining the general context of aspects of my research on the poetic and novelistic discursive practices that not only expose us to acts of atrocity and unspeakable yet spoken violence, but also by overexposure run the risk of impairing our ability to comprehend those very acts. I then gave some historical, cultural and political reasons as to why the Second World War, in all its permutations, has proven to be fertile ground for recent French fiction. And I think that the examples I cited to illustrate this, I hope, have given some idea of the wealth of material available. Reading these texts can be an arduous task, but then again, texts dealing with aspects of the death event should be arduous because they have the capacity to alter us, inhabit us, haunt us, augment or diminish us profoundly. And these potential transformations go to the core of the ethical encounter with literary texts that it is the task of criticism to articulate.